And Agile allows us the opportunity for that to occur. And we should feel, welcoming of those new and changing requirements, not discouraged by, gee, we just got to a static or steady state, and now we have something new we have to react to. Third principle that really stands out to us is the idea that we want to deliver results frequently, often in what is termed in Agile language, sprints. And we'll talk a lot more about sprints as we go forward, but the idea is let's not wait many months before we can deliver something, but let's figure out how we can organize the work to be done in short, intense work packets or work efforts called sprints so we can generate and realize some results. Next principle is the idea that the most efficient and effective method of conveying information is face-to-face. Now, in our technology-enabled world, there's a real desire to communicate, interact, solve problems, share information, so forth, technologically, on the phone, through FaceTime, Skype, other kinds of virtual settings. And while those are all very effective and have their place, one of the base principles of Agile is face-to-face is one of the most efficient and effective ways of doing it. And then lastly is this idea of simplicity. We tend to overcomplicate a lot of things in our organizations, not just the way we design software, but the way we design products, the way we transform organizations and conduct any number of activities. We have lots of great ideas, and sometimes we overcomplicate. And one of the basis principles of Agile is simplicity. Let's figure out what we can take out, what we can do later, and so forth, so that we can get real results quickly to our customers, and we can always work in a continuous manner to continue to improve the value that is created. Now, those are sort of the base principles upon which our discussion is going to be founded today. Now, what we'd like to do, Doug and I would like to share some comments that we hear when organizations are doing the process of organization design in an Agile way. Now, some of these are comments you might hear for a lot of things, but we know organization design is happening in an Agile way when we hear people say things like, the way we do organization design here is faster and more pragmatic than what I've experienced elsewhere. Secondly, you might hear something like, I can see the full organization transformation might take a while, but I feel like after each design session, we might call that a sprint, we've made noticeable progress. I can feel it, it's tangible. Third, you might hear something like, the design facilitators that help us through this process really facilitate an experience that best uncovers insights and aligns our teams and leadership's thinking. And it really helps us confidently drive forward with our transformation objectives. And the fourth thing is, we sometimes hear, I've learned a whole new way to work and engage with my colleagues in designing and aligning my organization. And then lastly, Agile design is a contrast from what we're used to. It's an engaging, practical way of getting things done quickly and innovatively. Now, I'm going to ask for a little self-reflection for those on the line today. If you have not in your organization heard leaders, practitioners, HR professionals say these kinds of things about organization design efforts, I'm not going to state the judgment that they haven't been effective, but I would say they may not be taking full advantage of Agile organization design principles. And if you do have people who are saying these kinds of things, then you can rest assured that your organization design process is trying or striving to follow and adhere to Agile org design principles. So that's sort of the setup and the framework we wanted to establish. Now, there are some very tangible things that leaders, executives, and also practitioners can do in their organizations day in and day out that will help make organization design efforts more agile. And we want to focus the rest of our discussion really on these three sort of keys to designing an organization in a more agile way. we think these are very actionable, but they are based on those Agile principles that we covered just a couple of minutes ago. And they should give us a real insight into how we can do organization design in a different, more Agile way. First principle that we'll highlight is that small bursts of innovation, creativity, and work accelerate the pace of progress. So that's the first principle key we're going to cover. The second one is co-creation leads to the best thinking and insights. And then the third one is organization design is an iterative process, and it is ongoing. You could argue it never ends. Now that might be scary to some people because they certainly want organization design or transformation efforts to end so they can get back to their real work. But we'll talk in a little bit about why it's important that organization design efforts, just like Agile development, is something that is iterative and ongoing. So those are sort of the three keys that we want to cover today, and we're going to dive into each of those.
So Reed, let me make a quick comment.
Of course.
So one of the things that goes along with these key elements is a lot of organizations want to get into more of a test and learn environment. And I think that also goes with one of these principles. So I've had some clients to say, you know, we're doing this design, and as we're going through this, can we go back and start trying out some of this stuff? And I say, you know, absolutely. Go see if this seems to work. If you've got some change or a little tweak that you just want to test because you don't know it'll work in this culture, don't wait for weeks or months to go test it. Do it right away. Come back, provide some feedback, and say, do we need to pivot here, or does this work, and we can keep moving forward. So that's another way to create sort of this test and learn environment to keep us focused and moving without having to wait to the end.
Thank you, Doug. Great application. I appreciate that. Yeah, we've worked with many organizations that have tried to adopt that practice, and as common sense as it is, it's actually hard to pull off because there's sometimes so many moving pieces in an organization that have to be coordinated. It's actually hard to try stuff without sort of getting everything lined up. So really appreciate you calling that out and thinking about how can we drive good test and learn as we go forward. Now, the first key that we want to get into is this idea that small bursts of innovation, creativity, and work accelerate the pace of progress. Now, to kind of set the stage for this key, you know, there's a funny picture here of it looks like a gentleman trying to push a boat off the shore here and get it moving forward. But what struck me about this picture as it pertained to this insight about Agile organization design was the idea that the propulsion, moving the boat at this stage, was not coming directly out of the back of the boat. There's something up there near the bow of the boat that's allowing the boat to actually move sideways. And probably doesn't move particularly fast. It's probably meant to be sort of a controlled, slow, gradual, movement. But nonetheless, there's something that allows the boat to move laterally away from the shore before it probably engages its main thrust to move in a forward or backward direction. And what really stood out to me about this, of course, is the idea that this little burst from this small propulsion at the front of the boat is what's going to get that boat started and get it doing something productive and making progress. And so I use that as a bit of an analogy to kind of help us visualize and get an image in our minds of what a small burst of innovation, creativity, or work could do to help us start making progress. Now, when we think about organization transformation, Doug and I want to share with you the way we start to think about this. Now, when you look at it, if you're really an Agile adherent, you'll say, gee, that looks like a waterfall. And that's, sort of exactly what Agile software development is working against, is more waterfall software development. But let me show kind of how this isn't waterfall in a sense. The first step in transformation is, of course, to understand what your organization is capable of doing and producing. And so there's a diagnostic step. And from there, you start to do some planning so that you can do what we, in our language, call the macro alignment of the organization. Are we set up at the most strategic level to enable and deliver our strategy, the way we want to win, and the way our resources should best be aligned and configured to drive that winning strategy? Then, of course, there's another step that goes into planning for more detailed operational level design work, which we call micro design, which really helps us redesign processes, jobs, incentives, KPIs, and even aspects of culture. And then from there, after we've been doing this architecting, then there really is a deployment and rollout effort. Now, it's awkward when we draw it this way, and it does indeed look waterfall, to say that the realization and sustainability happens after we've done all of this work up in the on the drawing board. But the reality is, if you're doing organization design in an agile way, and if you're following the principle Doug shared around implementing test and learns, you actually are trying out your strategy, your macro design, your micro design on a continual basis, to the point where you can then at some point really deploy this at scale in the organization. Now, of course, to make a transformation successful, it's not just Agile alone. It really entails leaders who are working throughout the process to make sure that the right stakeholders, the right leaders, the right organization choices are all lined up in a proper way. And of course, this is the process of leading a transformation journey. Leaders can't divorce their responsibility from it, and it sometimes needs project management support, particularly given its size sometimes, to ensure that it's happening in a planful and predictable way as best possible. Now again, you notice in some of my words that still feels very sort of old school project management or old school transformation. But let me show you how Agile starts to play into this. If we start to break this down a little bit and you go inside of the phases, and the phases for Doug and I are the assess and diagnosis, the strategy and macro design, the micro design, and the realization and sustainability, each of those, in a sense, is a development cycle, where inside of each cycle we are doing some iterative work, where we bring a team together to start doing work around a specific deliverable or set of deliverables. In our parlance, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, we would call that a design session. What's iteration one? It's a design session, or it's a planning session, where we bring people together face-to-face, following the Agile principle, and we begin to work on answering certain questions about how the organization needs to work. Now, just because we get 8 or 10 or 12 people in a room and have that discussion does not mean that we have solved everything. We have to come out of that iteration, and we've got to test it, or we've got to get feedback. And so from there, we need to be able to move to another iteration when necessary. If we go a step further on this, what you'll find is that that iterative work that happens at the phase level actually starts to happen more and more as you go down into the organization, and involves different people. The reason you see slightly different colors here is that, say, the blue set of iterations is the design work that is necessary for marketing. Then the gray work is maybe the work that's needed for sales. And then the orange work is the work that might be needed for something else. So the reality is that as we go through these phases and as we work through these different iterations, we are successfully getting closer to a design outcome that is more and more aligned with our ultimate goal and business objectives. Doug, I'm going to pause here for a moment and sort of get your take, because you work through this a lot with our clients. Have you seen a client employ some pattern like this, and what comes from it as they work through these design iterations?
Yes, that's a good question. So what I've seen a lot within organizations today is organizations are moving really fast. They need to introduce and develop new capabilities and deploy them faster and faster to meet new customer needs, new customer demands. So by going through these iterations in a continuous sort of planning or a continuous alignment methodology, is that you can deliver stuff quicker. rather than waiting for longer transformations or waiting till the end of this project, is how do we say, okay, here's a new capability, let's get it out and get it in place. Sometimes it's hard to go through this and say, well, how do we do that if we're going to change organizational structures and change, operating models? But a lot of times, as we're working through designs, if you're looking at the model of the cube model of how you do organizational design, structure is part of that, but a lot of it comes down to what are some of the processes you put in place, what are some of the roles and responsibilities. Those things can be done quicker and more iterative than some of the other areas of what you're trying to design. So what I'm trying to do is I'm going through a design session or working through a design is to say, what can we do quicker? What can we deliver faster? Prioritize those things and start executing even while other parts of the organization are still even doing design work. So there's multiple ways of looking at the iterations of, you could have the long transformations and doing pieces in there, or looking at micro designs and implementing capabilities fast.
Doug, that's perfect. Let me ask a follow-up question and get your take on this. Let's say that the blue work stream here is marketing and the gray one is sales. Clearly, there are going to be some interplays, I guess, between the two of those, between sales and marketing. And as we design something for marketing, we have to understand how that's going to play out for sales. Can you talk to a little bit about how to coordinate the flow and sequence of these design iterations if you're really going and implementing quickly?
If you look at some of the principles around Agile and you think about some of the Scrum meetings, the term Scrum meetings, where you have these meetings every morning or very quickly or on a routine basis, whether it's every morning or every couple mornings, it doesn't really matter, to say, let's talk about what's going on across all these different designs all at the same time so we stay in sync. So that's one of the biggest parts of sort of of Agile, are there's a lot of communication and doing it fast and doing it quick without a lot of bureaucracy. So I think that's one of the things you can do, is to say, if you're doing multiple designs, get your team together, have that meeting every morning and say, what are the interdependencies we're talking about today? What are the risks that we're seeing? And do it real time rather than waiting till the end.
Thank you. That's a perfect example. One of the questions that we've just received is, can we talk about some examples of when you might be doing some test and learning, particularly in the context of organization design? Because if you think about it, organization design can and should touch the work that people do and touch their jobs and roles. And you don't want to make a change in work or a person's job unless you're serious about it. So let me give an example, and if Doug has one as well, he can chime in. When we think about the idea of test and learns, you certainly have to be explicit right up front and say to the folks that are going to be involved, we are testing this. We have an idea, we have a solution, we have an approach that we want to try out. It might be a new work process, it might be a new customer interface, it might even be a new linkage that exists behind the scenes that connect one department with another department. And explain, we're going to test this. We don't know if it's going to work, but here's what we're trying to accomplish, here's what we need you to do, and then let's put it in play, and we'll get together in some period of time, and we'll evaluate what did we learn from that. And sometimes we'll jettison the learning from that and say that didn't work the way we wanted it to, or we'll say it worked, but we need to make some modification, and we'll go in and we'll do another design iteration, if you will, make the appropriate adjustments, and then we'll decide whether to test and learn that again or whether to move more to a full deployment now that we have some of those learnings. There's one other question I wanted to touch on that came in, and it talks about the difference between organization design and organization development. So that question is a great one, and it's one that probably deserves its own discussion or webinar at some point. But let me just quickly say that organization development typically operates, at least in my understanding, more at the team or group level. Organization design can operate at many levels in an organization, and the difference typically is that the organization development is about the interactions amongst people interpersonally and the group dynamics, whereas organization design is about setting up the organization choices to be able to drive and reinforce the kind of performance and work that the organization needs to produce to deliver strategy. Now, they may sound very, very similar, but one tends to be a little bit harder, organization design, on the hard parts of the business. How do we structure? How do we do work? What our incentives and KPIs are? And then the organization development side tends to be a little bit more on the group and individual dynamics that are at play. There's no question there's some overlap between those two concepts and ideas, but here's the thing. Regardless of whether you're dealing with organization design or organization development, the principles of Agile could apply. And what we're focusing today is on how these principles apply in organization design and the things that executives and practitioners need to know in order to apply these keys in a way that would allow their organization to do this work in an Agile manner. Great question, appreciate that. All right, let's move to our second key, which is the idea that co-creation leads to the best thinking and insights. And I've seen this happen, and I know Doug has too, and I'm sure many of you who are leaders and practitioners on today's webinar have seen this as well, that when you put diverse, bright minds together, you get really interesting and creative solutions to problems. And that's exactly what we want to achieve when we do organization design work, and especially when we do organization design in an Agile way. Now, Doug mentioned the idea of scrums, and we talked earlier about sprints. And so we'd like to draw some correlations to this idea so that we can use these concepts from Agile in a more conversant manner in the organization design realm. Now, when you start in the Agile software development or product development realm, what you'll find is that there's a product owner. And the role of the product owner is to have a vision about where the organization, or excuse me, the product or the software that the organization wants to create and or the features that it needs to have. From there, there's a team gathered. This is a rugby team because that's usually where we start to see the scrum happen. This is where you bring all those minds face to face and they start to work. There's someone who serves as a scrum master who makes sure that the team comes together in some sort of organized manner to work the problem. And they work that problem in a series of sprints. That means a period of time. It might be a day, it might be a week, sometimes it might be a couple of weeks, where they work in an intensive fashion to try to solve for some specific set of deliverables that the product owner has in connection with their vision for the product or software. And the Scrum Master's job is to help facilitate that. As Doug said, they might have daily interactions with the Scrum team so that they can make decisions, they can coordinate work that they're doing, but they're working in this defined period of time to produce some specific deliverables. Now, this same pattern actually applies on the organization design side of things. You've got a sponsor who has a strategy, or at least an idea of a strategy, and they have some criteria of what the organization needs to be able to do. Someone is identified to be the facilitator. They come with methods and tools to help the team come together in a design session, which is very similar to a sprint, to produce specific deliverables. So that's, for me, how these two concepts really start to come together. You're applying the principles in a very consistent way. And so when somebody says, well, I've been invited to a design session, you could just as easily say, I've been invited to an organization design sprint. And there's a person there who's going to be the Scrum Master, who's going to be the facilitator. And that facilitator or Scrum Master is going to have a set of tools, and they're going to help ask the right questions. They're going to help coordinate the right interactions so that we can make the best decisions to fulfill the strategy and design criteria of our sponsor. And that's how that interaction happens and how the great minds come together and are able to get this done.
So
now,
Reed, I have
oh yeah, please, Doug.
So, another idea here as you start thinking about the teams. One interesting idea that I've seen some clients think about and how to make this agile, how you make it faster. One of the issues that sometimes happens is you bring a team together to do a design, and you bring in these new people into a room, and you're thinking, okay, I need to bring in some lean people to do some process work, or some Six Sigma people, and I need some HR people in there, and I need this core team of people who's going to help drive this decision forward. So change management and HR and these process people. Think about it from a different perspective and say, you know what, if we had this core set of team, instead of just saying, okay, we have this one Scrum Master, we have a Scrum team that comes into a department or an area and says, you know what, we're already working together, we know what needs to get done, let's have this sprint, and we can move stuff done, get stuff done really quickly because we already have the change manager and we have the process people all together. We can make these changes and we can do stuff quicker, rather than having to bring in these new people to get to know each other all the time, which is one of the values of Agile, is you keep this persistent team, and they're making these increments every couple weeks. So you can still do that, even though you may do it in different departments. A lot of the team stays the same and allows you to get stuff done really fast because you're not having to form a team every time.
Great comment, Doug, and I would just build on that and say that in the design process, as you get further down the transformation journey, your team should be static while you're working on a certain level of the transformation or a certain part of the transformation. But eventually, you will cascade and involve more people down deeper in the organization in solving more detailed operational kinds of design problems. And those teams will have new members, but that team, when they're formed, should have some stability, just as you said, to the work deliverables that they're working to produce in their design sessions or sprints. Great comments. One of the things we wanted to highlight before we left this particular key was to highlight some of the questions that executives could be asking. And the reason we wanted to highlight this is because from a leadership perspective, let's just be candid, most executives are impatient. We want things done a lot faster, and we want tangible, measurable results. And so, you set up a team in an agile way, you tell them what the parameters are, you kick them off, everyone's excited, they go start working, the energy starts to flow, solutions start to emerge, and the executive shows up and says, why didn't you do that? Or why aren't you done yet? And it kills it. So rather than say that an executive can't be impatient, let's talk about some of the questions that executives can use that will empower Agile design teams rather than disempower them or demotivate them. So an example of a question is how, if I'm the leader asking, say, the Scrum Master, the design facilitator, or even the design team itself, are you helping define the vision, strategy, and design criteria? So it's reminding folks, what did we set out to do? Second question might be something like, do we feel like we have the right people involved in the Scrum or in the sprint? Is there anyone else we need? What resources? Thirdly, are you pulling people or resources from the team mid-process? Because that will, as Doug said, disrupt the synergy and the focus of the team. Are you comfortable with iterations toward a final product or outcome, or are you expecting perfection all at once? Are you allowing the time necessary for innovative answers to emerge? And are you asking the right questions? What would you recommend for overcoming this issue rather than, here's what I would do? Now, you can spend more time sort of digesting these, but we have found when an executive walks into a design session, they have one of two effects. Their presence alone, usually with the organizational power that they carry, will affect the team. Everyone starts to straighten up a little bit in their seats. They start to write neater on the flip charts. They do all those things that you would do when an executive walks in the room. But beyond that, some executives really motivate a team to keep working the problem because of the way they ask questions in a curious way. They ask questions in an open-ended way. And then there are those executives that walk in and ask those questions like, well, why didn't you? Why aren't you? And when those questions come, teams start to shrivel up. They feel like they're not guessing what's in the mind of the executive, and it kills the power and benefit of Agile development. So the last key that Doug and I want to hit on here is the idea that organization design is iterative and ongoing. And as we mentioned before, some people like to do organization design, claim victory, and then suggest we're good for a while. And unfortunately, we actually take a slightly different take on that, and we'll explain why here in a minute. But the idea is that you're constantly iterating towards something better. You're constantly iterating toward better alignment of choices. So in our book, and Doug alluded to the cube model earlier, we use the metaphor of a Rubik's Cube to talk about organizations. And the idea is that if you want to solve the organization and get it perfectly aligned, you have to make sure that the blue side and the green side and the red side and the white are all of the sides are lined up appropriately in their colors. And each side of the cube represents a dimension of the organization. A side might represent the work of the organization, or a side might represent the structure of an organization. And until you solve all of that, you have bits of the organization not working in concert with one another. And that's the whole point of the metaphor. So let's take this to the idea of iterative design. So as I just mentioned, each side of the cube represents a dimension of an organization. The question that we have to consider is anybody in an organization that isn't constantly changing? If you are, let us know. We'd like to come work with you because it would be very fun to just work with a stable, non-changing environment. Hopefully you're sensing some of the sarcasm, because there really is probably no organization that doesn't have some degree of change going on continually, which means that the design process, just like the Agile development process, never really ends. It continues to iterate toward more and more and greater alignment. Now let's talk about how this plays out. If we acknowledge that something is always changing in the marketplace, then something has to change in the choices in the organization that brings the cube back into optimal alignment. So we do what we can in solving the cube, and then a new regulation comes out, and we have to make some adjustment. Or a new expectation comes from shareholders, and so we have to take cost out, and so we have to change something in the way we're organizing, or we're set up and organized. So a stakeholder might say, we want a cube that has all 6 sides of the cube organized by color. So we put a team together, we understand the strategy and vision, we start to design. We figure out the choices at the macro level, at the micro levels, and then we start to implement. And then what happens? The stakeholders change their mind, or they come in with something different that they expect. And now we have to go and take our perfectly aligned cube, and we have to make some adjustments to it. And that's the premise, that because customers, markets, environments never stop changing, the effort of Agile organization design, and to some extent, is always continual. And we will always be making some tweaks. Sometimes they'll be very minor. It won't require a long bit of effort. It won't require a big team. We can just make some minor things. So that's what we see when we're looking in a static way. So that's kind of the key in terms of iteration and how we are constantly adapting. As we start to move to a closeout in our discussion, there's a question that we want to address, and then we invite anyone else to ask any final questions here before we wrap up. But one of the questions that's come in has to do with the idea that as you do this design work and you do it in sprints, what happens with, for lack of a better term, the ripples that happen in the organization? You do work in one area and it has an effect elsewhere. Or you have an idea of how to do something and it's not consistent with what another part of the organization is thinking about. great question, and I wish there were a simple answer. The answer is actually it takes work. And more importantly, if you think back to the transformation roadmap that Doug and I showed, we made a distinction between macro design and micro design. For us, macro design helps create the context and the operating model for the business, and the micro design become more tactical and detailed choices that the organization has to make in different pockets and areas of the business. If there is an organization that does not have a well thought out macro design, every part of the organization, it could be functions, it could be regions, it could be work process areas, whatever, will be trying to figure out and guess at how to best align their work to accomplish what they think the organization needs. Now, if the macro design is more clear, then what happens is those groups can run their sprints, can make their design choices in a way that is aligned to the broader picture, operating model, structure, and strategy. And so that's why when we think about doing organization design work, we think about doing it in a sequence of macro first, then micro. And hopefully macro, while it too will change, its revolutions will be slower than what may be needed at a micro level. And so hopefully there's some degree of stability in your macro design that helps as you're working through the ripples, the interdependencies, and so forth of the micro designs, that you can keep tying back to and make sure that your micro choices are lined up with what you've established at a broader level. Hopefully that answers the question. It's a great one. And as we're waiting to see if there's any last questions for today, what Doug and I wanted to do as we start to wind things down is to allow each of you to take a moment and reflect. Whenever we, put some ideas out there, we like people to sit back and ask themselves questions like, what can I do to encourage more agile ways of doing organization design? For example, we've been in organizations where the modus operandi is for a consultant to be hired, and the consultant knows your particular business or industry really well, and they come in with a proposal, and they tell you what to do. Well, that may be effective, that may help in some cases, but it may not build on all of the Agile principles that we've talked about. And you have to ask yourself, what are the trade-offs? What are we going to lose if we don't do this work in an Agile way? Second might be, as you look at your organization, how could your business take advantage of Agile organization design? Why set up big, long, multi-month, year kinds of efforts when you might be able to organize them into a little bit more discrete phases, and then even beyond that into some sprints that would get you some very tangible outcomes with the degree of face-to-face interactions that can be adaptive to your marketplace. And lastly, do you have in your organization the tools and methods to do Agile organization design? So you get the group together and you start to work it. If you immediately start with an org structure, you know that politics are going to be at the fore. So do you have tools and frameworks to help groups set aside the politics and be able to dive right into the really meaty strategic issues of organization design and iterate on those in a productive way rather than get caught up on what people are going to win and lose in the process? So that's some of our topics on personal reflection.
Reed, I just have a sort of, my last comment is just keep in mind that when Agile was originally put together, and we sort of alluded to this at the very beginning, Agile is all about principles. It is not a prescribed set way that has to work the same way every single time. A lot of times I'll have a client that says, you know what, this project just doesn't seem that it can fit an Agile model. It lends itself to be more waterfall because it's, software development or implementing a system where you just can't do pieces at a time. And my comment back to that is, that's great. Agile is all about principles. Look at the principles, apply the principles that make sense for whatever your project is, and that's all you're trying to do. So some lend itself more to Agile, sometimes things just don't, but think about the principles, and principles will help you no matter what type of project you have.
Doug, I'd love to have ended right there on your comment because that was just a great summary and a great reminder. Unfortunately, we got a couple of more questions, so we're going to dive back into our discussion just to hit on those quickly, but really appreciate the comment you made. One of the questions that just came in is, trying to talk about the issue of decoupling organization design from job design. You can't do that. Job design is an aspect of organization design. At the higher level, organization design, if it's equated to just structure, that, in our view, is way too limiting. As we just talked about in regards to the cube model, you have to think about organization design as being all of the systems and choices in the organization that can affect performance and behavior. And an org structure and a job description both have the ability to affect performance and behavior, just like a work process, or just like technology, or just like a incentive or a key performance indicator. All of those are choices that an organization can make that could affect performance and behavior. And so to try to divorce or take those apart, what you risk doing is losing the alignment that has to exist there. Now there's a follow-up question to that, which then deals with how do you get the culture of the organization to accept agile ways of working? Because it does take a degree of maturity, frankly, for people to come into a design discussion with the potential that their own jobs could be affected, and how do they talk about those issues in ways that transcend their own personal interests but really address the strategy and the needs of the organization. And that's a really great question. For us, we've seen a couple of things. One, it takes a great deal of leadership. When we showed the transformation roadmap, we talked about alignment leadership. One of the things that an alignment leader, this is a dimension of an executive's role, is to really help the organization understand the importance of achieving alignment. It's not, organization success is rarely achieved on a sustainable basis because you have a great product or service, or it's rarely achieved because you've come up with some new technological innovation. You might have a short-term advantage because of one of those things, but over time, the most sustainable, lasting, competitive advantage most organizations can achieve is in how they have set up their organization, not just structure, all aspects of the organization, thinking back to our cube model, and that becomes the sustainable differentiation. And as leaders start to help the organization understand that, you then say to folks, we're going to ask you to help us think about how to best align these choices in the organization. And we're going to put you on a team, and we're going to have you work in some design sessions to play through options using select tools and frameworks to come up with the best options. And at the end of the day, after we've decided what the best option is, we will then assess what does that mean for all of us. It might mean we need new training, and so some of us will have to go get new skills. For others, it might mean my job is no longer there. There's new jobs or opportunities I need to pursue. And even in some cases, it may mean there aren't jobs and opportunities for me anymore. But at the end of the day, if people understand what they're working for, we find that they can often transcend that. The second secret to that is really having effective tools and a process. And that's what we try to do when we work with our clients, is we work folks through a process using tools and frameworks that helps them transcend their personal interest. And they do that in a way that really helps the organization. And at the end of the day, they often are very excited and buy into something that they have a lot of personal uncertainty around. So it's not easy, but what we find often, and I'll tell one story to close this out. We were engaged by a client several years ago to come in because they were in a cost-cutting mode, and the leader came into the room and said, folks, I've gathered you here because we have to take some cost out. And the cost is not going to be just down through the bottom layers of the organization. I actually envision that in my team here, my direct reports, 2 people may not have roles in order for us to hit the kind of cost targets we need to hit. But I need your help figuring out how to do this. Now, it was a brutal couple of weeks as that team worked on those issues, and they worked through our process. But when they were done, several of the team members said to the leader, "This is the hardest thing we've ever had to do in our careers, but we are so grateful we were asked to be a part of it." And they actually put forward an option that took out more cost than the leader was asking for, and the leader said, "This is great, this is amazing, we don't need to be that austere about our cuts." And he made some changes to their recommendations that allowed it to not quite be so austere. So I just share that as an opportunity to highlight the fact that organization design can be very inclusive as long as you set the right expectations, use the right tools and frameworks. And then final question, then we'll close, is how do you measure progress? Well, progress is always hard to measure in an organization because there's so many variables that are going on. There are a couple of ways, and we've written some blogs on this that talk about measurement, but there's really a couple of things. First thing you have to look at when you're measuring progress in an iterative environment is, do you have a new design that is connected to strategy? Secondly, have you implemented that design? Surprisingly, there are so many organizations that don't implement what they actually architect and blueprint. And then thirdly, are you seeing improvement in key performance indicators? And those can be both financial or operational as well as other kinds of indicators, things like customer satisfaction or employee engagement or other kinds of things. But if you don't have some measure of all three of those, do we have a design that is indeed connected to what matters? Did we in fact implement it? And do we actually see movement in some of our key performance indicators? It's very difficult to see that in terms of progress. So we want to thank everyone for your engagement in today's discussion, and we thank you for your questions. As always, we like to leave you with an opportunity for further learning, and we want to make available to you, and this will be coming to you after having participated in our discussion today, a guide. It's an executive guide that deals with matrix organizations. So just for being here today, you'll get a copy of that, and hopefully you'll find that a nice addition to your study and learning in the area of organization design and transformation. So with that, Doug and I want to say thank you, appreciate you being here and with us today, and hope that you can make progress in your efforts to design your organization in an agile way. Thank you.